Before I call the Secretary of State to make his statement, I have to express once again my disappointment that the important announcements have been made first to the media rather than to this House. In this case, I accept that the issues of market sensitivity meant the announcements had to be made this morning. However, I am told the announcement were required because of speculation about the policy change over the weekend. That speculation appears to have been substantially accurate, which means that the media appears to have known the details before this House. If that is the case, I would be grateful if the Secretary of State could confirm that a leak inquiry is to be held. I now call the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Secretary of State Gove.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I would like to update the House on building safety. But before I do so, I can confirm that I have asked the Permanent Secretary at my department to conduct a leak inquiry. It was a matter of considerable regret to me that details of the statement that I'm about to give were shared with the media before they were shared with members of this House and indeed those most affected. It's worth pausing at the start of any statement to reflect on why building safety is an issue of concern to all of us in this House today. It took the tragedy at Grenfell Tower on 14th of June 2017, as a result of which 72 innocent men, women and children lost their lives, to put building safety properly on the political agenda. Families were living in a building that was literally a death trap because of failures of enforcement and compliance in our building safety regime. And this government must take its share of responsibility for those failures. And over 4 years on from that terrible tragedy, it is clear that the building safety system remains broken. The problems that we have to fix have been identified by many across this House from all parties. And I'd like at this point also to register my appreciation of the work that the late Jack Dromey did on this issue. He was Shadow Housing Minister for 3 years, and both as a trade unionist and as Member of Parliament for Birmingham Erdington, he did a great deal to bring to light the plight of those who were affected by this crisis. As we know, there are still a small number of high-rise buildings with dangerous and unsafe cladding which have to be fixed. Secondly, we know that those who manufactured dangerous products and developed dangerous buildings have faced inadequate accountability so far and shown insufficient contrition. We also need to ensure that we take a proportionate approach in building assessments overall. There are too many buildings today which are declared unsafe, and there are too many who have been seeking to profit from that current crisis. And fourth and most importantly, leaseholders are shouldering a desperately unfair burden. They're blameless, and it is morally wrong that they should be the ones asked to pay the price. I'm clear about who should pay the price for remedying failures. It should be the industries who profited as they caused the problem and those who continue to profit as they make it worse. And, Mr. Speaker, we'll take action on all of these fronts. To ensure that every remaining high-rise dangerous building has the necessary cladding remediation to make it safe, we will open up the next phase of the Building Safety Fund early this year and focus relentlessly on making sure it is risk-driven and delivered more quickly. We will also ensure that those who profited and continue to profit from the sale of unsafe buildings and construction products must take full responsibility for their actions and pay to put things right. Those who knowingly put lives at risk should be held to account for their crimes. And those who are seeking to profit from the crisis by making it worse should be stopped from doing so. Today, I'm putting them on notice. To those who missold dangerous products like cladding or insulation, to those who cut corners to save cash as they developed or refurbished people's homes, and to those who sought to profiteer from the consequences of the Grenfell tragedy, we are coming for you. I have established a dedicated team in my department to expose and pursue those responsible. We'll begin by reviewing government schemes and programmes to make sure that in accordance with due process, there are commercial consequences for any company which is responsible for this crisis and refusing to help to fix it. In line with this, just before Christmas, I instructed Homes England to suspend Ryden Homes, which is closely connected to the company that refurbished the Grenfell Tower, from its participation in the Help to Buy scheme with immediate effect. And I also want to welcome the decision by the Mercedes Formula One team and Toto Wolff to discontinue sponsorship from Kingspan, the cladding firm, with immediate effect. The voices of the families of the bereaved and the survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire were heard, but this is only the start of the action that must be taken. And, Mr. Speaker, we must also restore common sense to the assessment of building safety overall. The government's clear. We've got to find ways for there to be fewer unnecessary surveys. Medium-rise buildings are safe unless there's clear evidence to the contrary. There must be far greater use of sensible mitigations like sprinklers and fire alarms in place of unnecessary and costly remediation work. So to achieve that, I'm withdrawing the government's consolidated advice note today. It's been wrongly interpreted and it's driven a cautious approach to building safety in buildings that are safe that goes beyond what we consider necessary. And we're supporting new proportionate guidance for assessors developed by the British Standards Institution, which will be published this week. Second, we will press ahead with the Building Safety Fund, adapting it so that it is consistent with our proportionate approach. And we will set a higher expectation now that developers must fix their own buildings. And will give leaseholders more information at every stage of the process. And thirdly, before Easter, we'll be implementing our scheme to indemnify building assessors conducting external wall assessments, giving them the confidence to exercise their balanced professional judgment. And we will audit those assessments to make sure that expensive remediation is only being advised where it is necessary to remove a threat to life. I'll be working closely with lenders over the coming months to improve market confidence, and I've asked my colleague Lord Greenhalgh to work with insurers on new industry-led approaches that bring down the premiums facing leaseholders. Further, we'll take the power to review the governance of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors to make sure that they are equipped properly to support a solution to this challenge. Those in the industry who refuse to work with us in good faith to take a more proportionate approach should be clear about our determination to fix the problem for all those caught up in this crisis. Finally, we must relieve the burden which has been unfairly placed on leaseholders. And I want to pay tribute to all those across the House who've campaigned so passionately on this subject. They know the injustice of asking leaseholders, very often young people who have saved hard and made sacrifices to get their first steps on the housing ladder, to pay money they don't have to fix a problem they didn't cause, all while the firms that made a profit on those developments sit on their hands. So we'll take action to end this scandal and protect leaseholders. We will scrap the proposal for loans and long-term debt for medium-rise leaseholders. I can confirm today to the House that no leaseholder living in a building above 11 metres will ever face any costs for fixing dangerous cladding. And, working with members of both Houses, we will pursue statutory protection for leaseholders and nothing will be off the table. As part of this, we'll introduce immediate amendments to the Building Safety Bill to extend the right of leaseholders to challenge those who cause defects in premises up to 30 years retrospectively. And we will also take further action immediately. We'll provide an additional £27 million to fund more fire alarms so we can end the dreadful misuse of waking watches. We will change grant funding guidance so that shared owners affected by this crisis can more easily sublet their properties and encourage lenders and landlords to approve subletting arrangements. And in the period before long-term arrangements are put in place, I will work with colleagues across government to make sure leaseholders are protected from forfeiture and eviction because of historic costs. Innocent leaseholders must not shoulder the burden. We've already committed £5.1 billion of taxpayers' funding from this government, but we should not now look to the taxpayer for more funding. We should not ask hard-working taxpayers to pay more taxes to get developers and cladding companies making vast profits off the hook. We'll make industry pay to fix all of the remaining problems and to help to cover the range of costs facing leaseholders. Those who manufactured combustible cladding and insulation, many of whom have made vast profits even at the height of the pandemic, they must pay now instead of leaseholders. We've made a start through the residential property developer tax and the building safety levy, both announced last February, but we'll now go further. I will today be writing to developers to convene a meeting over the next few weeks, and I'll report back to the House before Easter. We will give them the chance to do the right thing. I hope that they will take it, but I can confirm to the House today that if they do not, then if necessary, we will impose a solution upon them in law. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we must never be in this position again. So we're putting the recommendations of the Hackett Review on building safety in law, and we will shortly commence the Fire Safety Act. We're also today publishing new collaborative procurement guidance on removing the incentives for industry to cut corners and to help stop the prioritisation of cost over value. And we will legislate to deliver broader reforms to the leasehold system as well. We will also bring forward measures to fulfil commitments made in the Social Housing White Paper so that when parliamentary time allows, we will have legislation on social housing regulation, so social housing tenants cannot be ignored as those in the Grenfell community were for many years. 4.5 years on from the tragedy of Grenfell, it is long past time that we fix this crisis. And through the measures that I've set out today, we will seek redress for past wrongs and secure funds from developers, from construction product manufacturers, and we will protect leaseholders today and fix the system for the future. And I commend this statement to the House.
I now call Shadow Secretary of State Lisa Nandy.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank you for your kind words about Jack Dromey, who should have been with us here today. There is a space over there that I know Jack would have occupied. Back in the 70s, horrified by the spectacle of a skyscraper in London that lay empty while people slept rough underneath it, Jack was one of those who occupied Centrepoint Tower in protest. He was never afraid to speak truth to power, and I hope that today marks the start of all of us across the House invoking his spirit. Because 4.5 years after the appalling tragedy at Grenfell and a road paved with broken promises and false dawns, hundreds of thousands are still trapped in unsafe homes, millions are caught in the wider crisis, and the families of 72 people who lost their lives are waiting for justice. So it's a relief that we finally have a consensus that the developers and manufacturers who profited from this appalling scandal, not the victims, should bear greater costs, and that blameless leaseholders must not pay. After a year of hell of the prospect hanging over leaseholders, we welcome the decision to remove the threat of forced loans. But can the Secretary of State tell us what makes him think that he can force developers who for 4 years have refused to do the right thing to pay up? We've been told there's a March deadline and a round table, but there isn't a plan. If he has one, can we hear it? Because he will find an open door on this side of the House if he has a credible proposal to bring. Today he warned developers that if negotiation fails, our backstop, what we can do, he said, is increase taxation on those responsible. But that isn't quite right, is it? I have here the letter from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and can I remind him what it says? He was told you may use a high-level threat of tax or legal solutions in discussions with developers, but whether or not to impose or raise taxes remains a decision for me, the Chief Secretary, and is not a given at this point. The thing is, Mr. Speaker, if I've seen this letter, I'm fairly sure that the developers have too. And it appears, furthermore, that what he's told the public, that tax rises are the backstop, is not what he has told the Treasury. This letter says, you have confirmed separately that DL-UHC budgets are a backstop for funding these proposals in full, should sufficient funds not be raised from industry. Now, that is not what the Secretary of State told the House a moment ago. So can he clear this up? Has the Chancellor agreed to back a new tax measure if negotiations fail? Or is he prepared to see his own already allocated budgets, levelling up funding, or monies for social or affordable housing raided? Or is his plan to go back to the Treasury and renegotiate and legislate if he fails in March? And if that is the case, Mr. Speaker, it will take months, and there is nothing to stop freeholders from passing on the costs to leaseholders in the meantime. Has he even got an assessment of how many leaseholders will be hit with whacking great bills if he delays? So, Mr. Speaker, if he's serious about going after the developers, and I hope that he is, why isn't he putting these powers into the Building Safety Bill now? Because the only trick that he's got up his sleeve, as he just confirmed to the House, is to ban them from Help to Buy. And we know that the impact of that, though welcome, will be marginal. Can he see the problem? He'll also know that there's a gaping hole in what he's proposed. A significant number of buildings have both cladding and non-cladding defects, and leaseholders in them face ruinous costs to fix things like missing fire breaks and defective compartmentation. Mr. Speaker, you cannot make a building half safe. Given that he recognises the injustice of all leaseholders caught up in the building safety crisis, why is he abandoning those who are hit with bills for non-cladding defects? And why will he not amend his bill so that all leaseholders are protected from historic defects in law? The truth is that the pace of remediation has been painfully slow. He is now on track to miss the deadline to fix all Grenfell-style cladding by over half a decade. And there are huge delays when it comes to Building Safety Fund applications. So will he get a grip on what is going on in his own department and ensure that the progress of remediation is accelerated markedly? Because for affected leaseholders, as he knows, this has been a living nightmare, and we owe it to them to bring it swiftly to an end. Mr. Speaker, what he's given us today is a welcome shift in tone and some new measures that we on this side of the House very much hope will succeed. But the harder I look at this, the less it stands up. We were promised justice and we were promised change to finally do right by the victims of this scandal. And that takes more than more promises. It takes a plan.
Tuesday.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Secretary of State for her questions. First of all, can I entirely agree with the generous and fitting words that she had for Jack Dromey. As I mentioned briefly in my statement, he was a relentless campaigner for social justice throughout his career, and indeed the role he played in particular in highlighting the plight of the homeless and the need to act in order to ensure that they had a safe and decent place to live is one of the many achievements that we will all record as we think of his contribution. Can I also welcome the consensual approach that she is taking and frontbench are taking to seeking to ensure that we place responsibility where it truly lies. And she had a number of appropriate questions to follow up in order to ensure that we deliver effectively. She made the point with respect to the Building Safety Fund that the allocations so far have been slow and we're behindhand, and that's true. I think it's always better to be honest about those areas where government has not performed as well as it should. And one of the first things that I did as Secretary of State when I arrived was to ask for all the steps necessary to be taken in order to ensure that that money was spent effectively. One of the problems that we've had is, of course, that it's a demand-led system, so we've relied on many of those who have been responsible as the individual owners of buildings to come forward. But one of the things we're also hoping to do is to ensure that, working with the National Fire Chiefs Council, that we have the most extensive analysis of all of the buildings that do need our support and that we accelerate work on BSF. So her concerns are not misplaced, and it is certainly my intention to ensure that we accelerate and make comprehensive that work. She also made the point that non-cladding costs do need to be met, and I agree. And she specifically requested that we provide amendments to the Building Safety Bill in order to ensure that there was statutory protection for leaseholders. That is our intention. We intend to bring forward those amendments, and I look forward to working with her and colleagues across the House in order to provide the most robust legal protection. She also doubted, and again I can understand the basis of her scepticism, whether or not developers, given their past behaviour, and indeed others in industry, given their past behaviour, would necessarily come sweetly to the table. And that is why it is so important that we have a range of tools available. I think it's important to recognise that there are some developers and some in the industry who have done the right thing. And it's also important to recognise that a spokesman for the House Builders Federation, Stuart Baisley, today struck a very constructive and open tone. But we do need to have additional backstops, and it is clear that taxes can, if necessary, play a part. I don't want to move there, but we do have the absolute assurance that we can use the prospect of taxation in order to bring people to the table. All taxation decisions are made by the Chancellor. No Chancellor, no Chief Secretary would ever say anything other than that. But the fact that the Chief Secretary and the Chancellor have authorised me to use the prospect of taxation, the fact that we already have taxation through the residential property developer tax, shows that we are prepared to take every step necessary. The final point, I think, which was implicit, perhaps explicit, in everything that the Shadow Secretary of State said, is that we'll be judged on our actions. And I think that is entirely fair. I recognise, given the scale of frustration that so many have felt in the past, that ultimately there can only really be satisfaction when we bring this matter to a conclusion. I believe that today marks a significant step forward, but there is more work to do, and I hope that we can conclude that work on a cross-party basis in order to bring justice to those who deserve it.
Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottom.
I'll cooperate. Can I say, Mr. Speaker, through you, to the Mother of the House, that the tribute to her husband Jack Dromey for his work, for people's interests at work and at home, will be long remembered, together with that of David Amos, who for 20 years worked on the all-party group on fire safety with Ronnie King and others. I believe this is another step forward which is greatly welcomed and greatly needed. I think the extension of the liability of 30 years is wrong for those who knew what they were doing was wrong. 30 years may be fine for those who did it by mistake, but for those who knew what they were doing, there should be unlimited liability, both in time and in money. I hope that the Secretary of State will have a round table, if he wants to take over the all-party group one, for a summit on this. You can pick up some of the other issues, which no doubt he's been working on, but to keep the statement reasonable, he may not have covered today. One problem are the insurance premiums paid by leaseholders for the property they don't own, which may have gone up from an illustrative £300 a year to £3,000 a year. I believe that the Association of British Insurers should be told that the Competition and Markets Authority will look to see whether there is price gouging, in simple terms, and if there's some kind of catastrophic reinsurance needed, that the government will help them to make communal arrangements to deal with that, because those insurance premiums should come down to the £300 that they were before. The last point of very many I'd like to make is that the Treasury will expect to get the benefit of levy and tax towards the £5 billion already announced, and the contributions which will come in from developers will relieve burdens on residential leaseholders, but the government also gets the VAT on money that's spent, which is 20% of the total cost. If the total cost has come down from 15 billion to, say, 12 billion, my right honourable friend can calculate and discuss with the Treasury how much extra the Treasury is getting. The Treasury should not be making a profit out of all this catastrophe.
Can I thank the Father of the House for his questions, and also say that he is quite right that Sir David Amess, before his sad death, was one of the most prescient and one of the most effective campaigners for improved building safety, and his memory was very much in my mind. The point that the Father of the House makes about the need to look potentially at unlimited liability for those who consciously and deliberately operated in a reckless fashion is one that I will consider, and I'm sure will be considered in the passage of the bill. His point that we should work with others, particularly the broad leasehold community who've done so much to identify the way forward, is absolutely one that we intend to do. The point that he makes about insurance premium is absolutely right, and that is why my noble friend Lord Greenhouse will be talking to Baroness Morgan of Coates and others in the ABI in order to ensure that more insurers like Aviva do the right thing. And I very much note his point about VAT and Treasury contributions, and in the ongoing conversations that we have with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I'll reflect the very important point he made.
SNP spokesperson Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I wish to echo the sentiments around the House to the work Jack Dromey has done on this issue and his campaigning to get justice for those affected. It's been almost 5 years since the Grenfell fire, and in that time we've had 4 housing secretaries and several different policies and approaches to this issue. First, the government would pay, then leaseholders would pay, and now developers will pay, all because the Treasury has for so long refused to act further on this issue. This confusion is not only harming homeowners facing a Tory cost of living crisis, but also affecting the ability of devolved governments to plan their responses appropriately. So can the Secretary of State guarantee that this latest policy will be acted upon, and will he commit to working with the devolved governments to provide further clarity? And additionally, can he make clear when already promised funding will fully and finally be delivered to the devolved governments for this matter?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for her points, and we certainly will work with devolved governments. Of course, the residential property developer tax, like all UK-wide taxes, is distributed appropriately in line with the Barnett formula and other requirements, but we will certainly work with devolved governments. And I should say that I'm very grateful to both the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government and the Northern Ireland Executive for the work that they've already done on this issue, and we all have much to learn from one another.
Thank
you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the direction of travel in this statement, specifically that leaseholders will not have to pay for cladding remediation. I'm also glad to see that building products makers are now coming within the scope of government and not only property developers, because I personally have been shocked by some of the revelations coming from the Grenfell inquiry, and I do think that potentially we need to address the building product sector. Can I stress to my right honourable friend that speed and delivery here is critical. It is now 4.5 years since the tragedy in my constituency, and what is important is not only having a good plan, but it is executing it quickly and efficiently.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I'm very conscious of the need for speed. I quite agree. If you look at the behaviour of some of the cladding firms, if you look at the behaviour of people who work for Kingspan and Arconic, and the evidence that's been presented to the Grenfell inquiry, it is truly dreadful. And individuals concerned must take responsibility. And certainly, she's absolutely right. She represents a constituency in which there are many, many people who are trapped effectively because of the failure of the property market to be effectively have all of these problems addressed. And in the interests of her constituencies and so many more, and in particular in the interests of the Grenfell community and their fight for justice, then I'm very conscious of the need to move as fast as we possibly can.
Sir, the Select Committee flag backs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for his statement, and I'm sure he will welcome an invitation from the Select Committee to come and discuss these matters further in detail. Just two important issues. First of all, would you just clarify that leaseholders are not going to have to pay the cost of remediation, including non-cladding work? Because that's not exactly what his statement says. And secondly, social housing providers. Would he clarify that apart from the removal of ACM cladding, the government's going to give them no help whatsoever? And if developers don't pay for the measures he announced today, or taxes aren't raised, and there are cuts to his budget as a result, is that going to come off social housing provision as well? So what assessment is done of the total impact on future house building of social housing?
Well, three very important points. The first is we will make sure that we provide leaseholders with statutory protection. That's what we aim to do, and we'll work with people, colleagues across the House, in order to make sure that that statutory protection extends for all of the work required in order to make buildings safe. Secondly, when it comes to making sure that we don't have an adverse impact either on social housing or indeed on the work that Home England is leading on to bring together and to remediate brownfield land for new private sector development, we absolutely will make sure that we do everything possible in order to have responsibility discharged by those who are ultimately those with big balance sheets and big bucks. He and I will know that the major 7 housing developers, and indeed they do much good work, but nevertheless, in the last 3 years, they made profits of £16 billion. Those are significant sums, which understandably people are prompted to ask should be devoted to ensuring that the building safety crisis is met alongside the building supply pipeline of the future.
Rick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome these further measures to provide absolutely critical support to leaseholders and to restore a greater degree of confidence to the housing market? In particular, can I welcome the further support for those in medium-rise buildings? Of course, it's a pity that the Treasury didn't agree to that proposal in January of last year, but such is the way with this issue. Can I ask him 2 particular points? Firstly, he's agreed a backstop with the Chief Secretary, whereby the ultimate risk will be borne by the provision of social housing. I'm sure he would agree that it would be quite wrong for social housing tenants and the homeless to pay the price for solving this issue. So could he say that that won't be the case? And secondly, I see that the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors have failed to make good on the conversations that we've been having for several months, if not years now, to instil a more proportionate and sensible approach into the assignment of risk. What further steps, and he alluded to some in his remarks, can he take against RICS? Because I think their behaviour is now bordering on scandalous in not taking this issue seriously.
Well, can I first of all pay tribute to my right honourable friend and predecessor? I've had the opportunity since joining the department to see just how hard he worked, facing a number of frustrations in order to secure justice for those who are our first concern. And I had some comments from some on the opposition benches seeking to decry that. Honestly, if you knew what I knew about how hard Robert had worked in order to try secure justice, you wouldn't be trying to make a cheap point about it. So So, no, look, we all care about this issue, but few care about this issue as much, and certainly no one in this chamber at the moment has worked as hard to try to help those people as my right honourable friend. So I'm not having it. And then the second point that my right honourable friend made is absolutely right. We need to ensure both that there is more social housing provision and that we also improve the quality of social housing. That is a core mission for the department. His third point about the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors is right. There have been all sorts of difficulties with that organisation in the past, but I'm now hopeful that we're on a more positive footing. We do have the potential to take steps to improve the governance of the institution, but I am hopeful now that, given some of the conversations we've had, including with lenders and others, that we can be on a more positive footing. But let me once again underline and affirm my gratitude to my right honourable friend for his incredibly hard and dedicated work in order to try to bring this situation to a satisfactory conclusion.
Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Eclipse House, Station Road, Wood Green, have been suffering for over a year now with astronomical costs for gaps around fire doors and external wall insulation. Can the Minister confirm that that's not covered in today's statement? And secondly, what voice will tenants have in the future? Because one of the worst things about Grenfell is the lack of tenant voice to make good things stick when bad practice is all around.
Yeah. The Honourable Lady makes two very important points. On the first, it is the case that those who are the freeholders, the ultimate owners of these buildings, will be held responsible for all of the work that is required, and we will make sure that leaseholders are not on the hook for that. On the second point, she's absolutely right. Those who've had an opportunity to listen to some of the testimony at the Grenfell inquiry, those who've seen some of the excellent campaigning journalism associated with it, will know that people like Ed Defan and others warned explicitly of some of the consequences of the approach that was being taken at the time, and tenants' voices were not heard, and people died as a result. So that's why the Social Housing White Paper, which my right honourable friend did so much to advance, and the Social Housing Bill, which will be coming forward in due course, are so important.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to welcome the statement. I think it's an absolutely brilliant statement, and I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for the work he's done constructively to work with ourselves, cross-party, and the cladding groups to actually get to where we are today. I think what we've announced today is another huge step forward for leaseholders. It's victory for leaseholders. We're up to over £9 billion in support for leaseholders, and we will be making those responsible pay and start on the journey. There are two areas of clarification I would like. The first is cladding is an external fire safety defect, but there are internal fire safety defects developers are responsible for, such as missing fire breaks, and that stops the spread of a fire from one flat to another flat internal in the building. And the second area that I'd like clarification on is, will there be government amendments to the Building Safety Bill to make it clear in law that leaseholders are the innocent parties and will not have to pay?
Well, can I first of all thank my honourable friend for his fantastic campaigning on this issue. On the first point, it will be the case, and it's linked, of course, to his second point, it will be the case that those who are the owners, the freeholders, the responsible figures in charge of these buildings, who will be held responsible and made responsible for making sure that all the work is done in order to make buildings safe. And we will be bringing forward amendments to ensure that on a statutory basis we can protect leaseholders from having costs passed on unfairly by the owners of the freeholds of these buildings.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Speaker, when the horror of Grenfell happened, many local authorities, like my own, responded immediately and inspected all buildings and took action as appropriate, as they should have done. The private sector did not in the many leasehold properties we have. And I had a very sad conversation with a group of leaseholders a month ago. They're stuck, they can't sell, they can't move, they've got expanding families, and they're completely stuck and faced with massive bills. Can I go to them tomorrow and say the government will underwrite all the costs that they've been threatened with at the moment, so they can get their building brought up to standard, and if they wish to, sell and move on? Or is this going to be months and months of delay until such time as the private sector decides not to pay and the government intervenes? I think those leaseholders, like leaseholders all over the country, deserve an immediate answer. They've been through too much stress.
Well, perhaps for the first time in the House, I'm almost wholly in accord with the right honourable gentleman. I do think that they deserve speedy action. But I don't want to overpromise. I do believe that we can rapidly relieve the difficult situation in which his constituents find themselves. I don't think it can be immediate, but it's certainly my intention to ensure it is as quick as possible. And I also, and again, please forgive me for making this point, I do agree with them that many in local government across party were far quicker to respond to this crisis than some in the private sector, and that's shaming.
Andrew Mitchell.
I do apologise, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much indeed. My right honourable friend will be aware that this whole issue has caused extraordinary misery, anxiety and upset. And I had the opportunity this morning of speaking to Jim Illingworth of Brumlag, with whom he and my right honourable friend from Newark and our friend Jack Dromey have worked so closely. And he was clear that he is very grateful for this progress. We are seeing a mixed economy of response, although there are clearly issues of timing and other details, which I have no doubt he will need to address. So I hope my right honourable friend may still accept that he needs to crack the whip on this, but is he not well able to do that?
Well, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for his point, and indeed I had the chance to chat to Jim Illingworth and other cladding campaigners earlier today. And he's absolutely right. I know that as a Birmingham MP, my right honourable friend is all too well aware of how many people in that great city are affected by this crisis, and I look forward to working with him and others to resolve it as quickly as possible.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A retired teacher in my Liverpool Riverside constituency invested in 2015 in a property, but just before Christmas they were issued with a massive bill for £200,000 for an increase in their costs and a possible £9 million for remedial work on their property. So will the Secretary of State agree to meet with me and the leaseholders to talk about how this policy change will benefit them? Thank you.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I will make sure that either I or others in my department have those conversations as quickly as possible.
Mike Penny.
Can I also welcome the statement today, and also the work that the Housing Minister has done with colleagues across the House to explain how the policies were going forward, because this has been a nightmare for leaseholders. Two quick questions. If leaseholders have already paid out these amounts of money, are they going to get that money back from the freeholders or the developers? And secondly, on the issue of insurance, which was raised by my colleague earlier on, does the Secretary of State realise that even though they're liable for the costs of building insurance, they have no rights at all in the policy? So when that situation occurs, they can't claim against the policy, it's only the freeholder can do so, and that must be something that gets changed in the bill.
Well, there are a few people who know as much about fire safety in this House as my right honourable friend, and it is certainly the case that we will work with him in order to explore the specific insurance provisions that he mentioned. I can't, unfortunately, I wouldn't want to mislead, say that we will be in a position to compensate those who have already contributed. What we're seeking to do is to ensure that individuals do not face costs in the future. But again, I will work with colleagues across this House in order to try to get to the most equitable position possible.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to seeing the amendments from the government about how leaseholders will be protected, because my constituents in St Albans have had too many false dawns, like many others. But I wanted to ask about the Secretary of State's review of proportionality. In the past, building safety assessors have been chosen because of their willingness to recommend the less expensive safety work, and this has created a race to the bottom. So will the Secretary of State confirm that the BSI guidance will be mandatory for building safety assessors, and will he put protections in place so that assessors don't get away with offering the most light-touch mitigations that they can get away with?
Well, firstly, can I thank the Honourable Lady, because always difficult for me to praise a Liberal Democrat, but she's been campaigning consistently on this issue for some time and has done a great job in bringing to light some of the defects that need to be addressed. Yes, it is the case that the BSI work, we believe, will ensure a properly proportionate approach. There are incentives either way. There are incentives sometimes For some to seek to do work on the cheap incentives, for others sometimes to exaggerate the scale of work that may be required in order to generate business. But I hope that a truly proportionate and safe approach will be now followed as a result of the BSI's work.
Royston Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I joined this campaign a year or so ago because, as the Secretary of State said in his statement, that leaseholders are blameless and it's morally wrong to make them pay. So I look forward to seeing that become part of the bill so that leaseholders will know they will never have to pay. But can I go back to insurers again? Because not only are they increasing premiums by up to 1,000% on people that can't really afford the premiums they were paying before, but they were part of the problem. They were indemnifying these developers, they were underwriting these developments, they are part of the warranty issue, and yet it's not been brought in scope as part of the solution. So can the Secretary of State look again and make sure that insurers have to pay in the way that developers will?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and of course his campaigning has been a significant factor in helping us to get to the right position, or certainly to a better position. We want insurers to be part of the solution, as we want everyone to be part of the solution as well. And my right honourable friend Lord Greenhalgh is doing great work with them. I think there'll be an opportunity, I'm sure, before too long for me to explain in greater detail with Lord Greenhalgh to my honourable friend and to others the progress that we're making, but I think he's absolutely on the button in pointing out some of the mistakes that have been made in the past that do need to be addressed by the insurance sector.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I note that the Secretary of State said that he would extend the right of leaseholders to challenge those who cause defects retrospectively for 30 years. But he will be aware that unscrupulous developers like Mr Jason Alexander in my constituency exploit loopholes in company law, which mean that there is no corporate entity to go after because it has been wound up, struck off or stripped of assets. Can he say what work he is doing with BEIS to ensure that these loopholes in company law are closed? And can he also say whether the obligations that the developer will now face as a result of his statement today will take precedence over other financial obligations of those developers?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes two very important points. On the first, yes, it's been a feature. I wasn't fully aware until I took on this responsibility of how some within the development industry play fast and loose with the rules and set up special purpose vehicles, shell companies and so on to evade their responsibilities. And they exhibit the unacceptable face of capitalism, I'm afraid. And there is work that requires to be done in order to bring them appropriately to account. She is absolutely right, and I'll be working with colleagues across government to do just that.
Mr. Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's announcement today, and like others, though, I will be awaiting the detail, not least because I was calling for leaseholders to be protected from the cost of cladding when I was Minister in the department. So what has happened to change the government's mind?
I was going to say, as so often, my right honourable friend is ahead of her time. And there have been any number of occasions, including recently, when I've had to acknowledge that she's been right and the rest of us have been wrong, and this is one of those occasions.
Very good.
Today, the Secretary of State has told us what many all across this House told the government 3 years ago, that individual leaseholders trapped in unsafe homes should not have to bear the cost of making them safe. But today's statement focuses on cladding, when the vast majority of leaseholders are suffering in unsafe homes are the result of other insulation and fire-stopping defects. How will he address that? He also told the companies to pay up, but many have now gone into voluntary liquidation. We need a windfall tax on the whole industry now. Far too many leaseholders have been waiting for 3.5 years in Purda. They now find, many of them, like my constituents in Central Square, they've been waiting since the 31st of July even to get a response from the BSF. Can he actually get his own department to be a bit more expeditious?
Honourable gentleman makes a number of very good points. Yes, the department does need to be more expeditious. Yes, we're focused on doing just that. Yes, it's important that those who are the freeholders, the ultimate owners, do deal with all of the fire safety issues. And yes, it is absolutely right that while ACM Cladding is simply the most egregious example of buildings being unsafe, there are many other issues that do require to be tackled.
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement? I think it's long overdue. Many in my constituency and others face huge bills, as he knows that. The biggest problem is trying to get the developers to talk to those that have actually now suffered. I spent 2 years trying to get Telford Homes even to meet with leaseholders, and they've refused, gone to ground and won't say a word. So the question I really got is, how has my honourable friend, with all due respect, because the government's been talking to developers for some time now, but nothing has really come of it, how is he going to drive them to meet leaseholders and the insurance companies for those who actually have gone out of business and they insured them? Taxes can take time. What about fines instantaneously?
Well, by any means necessary, and I think that my right honourable friend is absolutely right. My preference, wherever possible, is to proceed consensually and to think the best of people. And it is undoubtedly the case that there are many people in the property sector and in the development sector who have done the right thing and others who hope to. But absolutely, if we need to, then we will deploy heavier artillery in order to ensure that we get the support we need to those on the front line.
Sarah.
The statement from the Secretary of State is a step in the right direction for sure. I have many tall buildings in Croydon Central, and the complexity of some of their issues are very significant, and the costs of what they bear are very significant, and they don't involve anything that would be covered today. So longitude and altitude blocks, 2 blocks in my constituency that have to pay for compartmentalisation, or Bridge House, which is over 18 metres, is cladded, but the cladding is not categorised as the right cladding to qualify for funding under the government's scheme. I also have constituents who live in blocks where the developer has gone bust, the freeholder is overseas, and they have a very tenuous relationship with the managing agent. It's very difficult to get any information. All of those situations are very difficult. I wonder, on that point, whether the Secretary of State can speak to that kind of wider issue and what can be done there, but also what his estimate is of the cost of making all these buildings safe.
Well, the Honourable Lady makes a series of important points. I know that she's already been in touch with the department, but I want to be more closely in touch with her. Our project team, Operation Apex, are making sure that we can do everything possible in order to ensure that the ultimate responsible owner is identified and takes on the responsibility for the work that she has correctly identified. And so I'll look forward to working more closely with her to address precisely that issue.
Morrissey.
Speaker, may I thank my right honourable friend for standing up for leaseholders, particularly young people who have just gotten onto the housing ladder, and may I ask him to look at sprinklers again as a safety measure. It's required in many countries. It's always perplexed me why it isn't required here, so I would ask that he would look at that. And also the building materials used for social housing. Oftentimes developers use lower quality materials which create a greater safety risk. So if there could be that level of scrutiny for social housing to protect social housing tenants as well.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and was an incredibly hard-working figure in local government in London who helped to ensure that the needs of those in social housing were understood. And it is the case that there are specific provisions in the building safety legislation which has been brought forward by my right honourable friend, the Housing Minister, to address some of those precise questions about poor quality material in social housing.
Samuel Wilson.
It's right that leaseholders should not be held responsible for the faults of builders in the past, and I welcome the statement. But given that housing is an evolved matter in Northern Ireland, I assume that the issues which have been discussed here today will not automatically apply to Northern Ireland. And could the Minister tell us what discussions has he had with the Communities Minister and the Finance Minister, both of whom are responsible for the housing and the building regulations issue here, given that Sinn Féin seem to take the view that anything which emanates from here, regardless of how beneficial it is to people in Northern Ireland, is not acceptable?
They're very fair points, and I've written to ministers in the Northern Ireland Executive and the other devolved administrations today to outline the approach that we're proposing to take, and I will work with ministers from whatever party, and I absolutely take on board the point he makes, in order to ensure that we get to the right position. And I'm grateful, I have to say, to the First Minister, to Paul Given, for the support that he's given us in the run-up to this announcement overall. Much appreciated.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everyone can remember their first visit to Bolton, but on your next visit to Bolton, would the Secretary of State come with me to Holden Mill on Blackburn Road and Astley Bridge to meet with residents to see progress that's been made on the removal of cladding, but also to discuss with them issues around poor build quality and how this government can fight their corner?
I absolutely will, and I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, who's a very, very effective advocate for Bolton.
David.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to add my voice to the sudden passing of Jack Jerome, who is truly a pleasant and decent person. I'd like to add my condolences to the mother of the house and especially to his son, Joe Jerome, who I know very well, especially when we were councillors together in Lewisham. Leaseholders are feeling anxious and angry about the delays and uncertainty as to when the cladding will be removed from buildings and associated safety problems also dealt with. This is true of leaseholders, residents of the Parkside development in my constituency. This spring, the developers and the Housing Association have said that they will start to look at doing the remediation work, but they will provide no absolute guarantee that any cost will not be passed on to the leaseholders. Will the Secretary of State look at this case and review it to provide that certainty that leaseholders in my constituency desperately need?
Yes, I absolutely will. Thank you for bringing it to my attention.
Ray Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and for his sheer determination to not only hold those people responsible for the wrongdoings that they did, but also to stand up for leaseholders. But building owners are still dragging their feet, delaying essential remedial works, even though they might be eligible for government funding. So what incentive can my right honourable friend give today to those building owners to complete the works as soon as possible and not put the concerns about their own financial liabilities, however theoretical they are, above the concerns of safety of residents in those blocks?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right, and I think that it's certainly the case that many already enlightened owners have done just that. But one of the things that we are saying today is that ultimately we will ensure in law that it's the ultimate owner of the building that is responsible for that work. So the incentive is to move now for fear of consequences later.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to see the Secretary of State acknowledge the unjust treatment of especially buildings under 18 metres. However, it appears that what the Secretary of State's outlined will involve a voluntary contribution from developers, which may take a while. The leaseholders in my Vauxhall constituency don't have a while to wait. They're fed up of waiting. It's been 4.5 years. They want solutions now. So will the Secretary of State confirm that he absolutely understands that urgency that leaseholders want to see and call on those developers to take action now?
Absolutely. Again, I don't want to overpromise, but I do recognise the need for speed. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the complexity of this issue has been highlighted by my right honourable friend's statement and the questioning. Can I challenge him just on one particular point? As my honourable friend for Hemel Hempstead raised, thousands of people will have received large bills, many will have paid them. My right honourable friend is saying that he will take statutory powers in the bill that's coming before us. When will that happen? And will that be the operational date when this House has voted on those powers for bills then not to be presented to leaseholders from that date forward? Or can leaseholders who've refused to pay the bills thus far say, thank goodness, I don't have to pay anything?
Well, my honourable friend, who's been a consistent campaigner in this area, makes a very, very good point. One of the things, again, I don't want to make a cast-iron commitment at the dispatch box on the operational date, but one of the things that I will do is work with him and others as we frame the legislation and make sure that he has access, insofar as it's possible, to the legal advice that we have, so that we can stress test it and provide the maximum level of protection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency, I've spoken to many leaseholders who've struggled with issues around fire safety and cladding and the impact it's had on their mental well-being. We raised this issue in committee stage of the Building Safety Bill, and the response was they should just access mental health support through their GP in the usual way. We know the pressure that what that GPs are under at the moment. So will there be any additional measures brought forward by the Secretary of State in light of his statement to support the mental health of leaseholders?
It is the case that some of the leaseholders face additional vulnerabilities. Some have had mental health problems. There are other leaseholders living with disabilities who have particular problems, and I think it's important that we develop a comprehensive package for all. So I will look into that. Yeah.
Mary Robinson.
And I welcome this announcement and thank my right honourable friend for listening to leaseholders who have faced the prospect of bankruptcy because of the defects which needed to be put right, and confirming that he will also keep in mind that when cladding is removed, other defects may come to light, and would he commit to looking at this as it goes forward, and also to ensure that those bodies who are responsible for this cladding crisis cannot find a place to hide and will be pursued to pay for it.
Absolutely. I totally agree with my honourable friend that we need to take all means to pursue those who are ultimately responsible, and that we also need to recognise that, exactly as she says, when some remediation work is undertaken, sometimes other flaws are revealed and they do need to be addressed.
Mr. Speaker, and I associate myself with all the comments that have been made about my colleague Jack Jerome. I welcome the steps forward that we've taken at every stage when a Secretary of State has come to the House and made a statement. It's the steps backwards that we make after the statements that are causing me problems. I have a property that is about 18 metres high. The residents have done their own survey. They say it's over 18 metres. The management agency says it's over 18 metres and should therefore qualify for building safety fund. And it's difficult to resolve these issues. Meanwhile, the residents are paying out for Waking Watch, and they've been doing that £28,000 a month for nearly 4 years. So how retrospective will this be? Will my constituents be compensated for what they've, I think, had to pay out unfairly, because it would have been far cheaper to put a fire alarm system in than to continue to pay Waking Watch? And will we see an end to the EWS1 forms, or will RICS come back at us and say we can't possibly do that, as they've done before?
No, I can quite understand his frustration, and as my honourable friend, the member for Harrow, pointed out earlier, and as this question lays bare, there are a complex set of interrelated problems. We're making money available in order to ensure that we can get rid of Waking Watch in all but save a very few circumstances. I recognise that there are people who have faced costs so far, and again, it depends on individual circumstances as to whether or not there are ways, depending on the ultimate owner of the building, whether or not they can receive compensation. But I don't want to make any guarantees about that in a blanket way today. On EWS1 forms, I think we could dramatically reduce their use as a result of the engagement that we've made with lenders and with RICS. But again, it will still be the case that there will be some 11 to 18 buildings in the meantime, even as we get a more proportionate approach, where there will be work of that kind that is required, but we want to absolutely reduce it.
Ben Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the commitment of the Secretary of State to hold those accountable who are responsible for this, and that it is morally wrong that leaseholders should foot the bill. I know that this announcement and this progress will be welcomed by residents of Vizian Apartments in Milton Keynes, among thousands and thousands of others across the country. Can he confirm that this means that the government is accepting the principle of polluter pays in this instance? And how confident is he that the cowboys will cough up without additional taxation?
We do accept that principle, and we will do everything that we can to round up the wrong uns. But I do recognise that we are dealing with some individuals who behaved unscrupulously in the past and who will do everything to evade their responsibilities, which is why we need tax as a backstop.
Howell Williams. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. There are many Welsh victims of this particular scandal, including in my own Arwen constituency and elsewhere in Wales, as I'm sure the Secretary of State will hear now. Now, I'm very much in favour of holding the industry account, but I have to tell the Secretary of State that long experience of trying to hold the cavity wall insulation industry to account, albeit as a backbencher, that experience is not encouraging. So I would wish all power to his elbow on that matter. I was glad to hear him say that he will be working with the government in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Can his officials have a look at a particular issue which might be of companies which are working from England and subject to his strictures, of course, but then working into Wales, and that might be a complicating factor?
We absolutely will, and I'm very grateful for the approach that he outlines, and indeed we want to work with the Labour Plaid Cymru administration in Wales in order to get to the right result.
Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful for the statement made by the Secretary of State today, but I have to gently remind him that those members who have worked hardest on this issue have been those Conservative members supporting their constituents on this side of the House. Two in particular, the member for Southampton, Itchen, and Stevenage, who worked incredibly hard upon this issue. But can I ask the Secretary of State to confirm that no leaseholder living in the building or not, in a building of 11 metres or lower, or having problems with external or internal building defects, will have to pay any costs whatsoever?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point and allows me to place on the record my thanks to the members for Southampton, Itchen and Stevenage. I think their campaigning has been incredibly important in getting us to this point. I completely agree with them. And it is the intention, and we will use statutory means in order to ensure that happens, that the ultimate owner of a building is responsible for all of the safety steps that are required, and that is what we will seek to do with the help of colleagues across the House.
Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I also welcome the commitment to leaseholders in this statement and the putting on notice the businesses and the chance to do the right thing. When will the deadline for this chance to do the right thing be up? Otherwise, we could be just kicking the can down the road. Leaseholders in Putney will want to know when they can expect to be able to sell their homes to move on. And will there be a sort of government guarantee, a letter written so that they can move on, something that they can use with estate agents and with others to know that they can move on with their lives? And finally, there is a residence in Putney which is just under 11 metres. They've been given a bill of £1 million for their remediation. Will they be included within this as well?
Yeah. Well, I'll look at the specific case of the building which falls just under 11 metres that the honourable lady mentions. More broadly, I'd absolutely love to be able to provide people with reassurance from tomorrow that the cloud will be lifted. But as a number of members have pointed out, there are a complex set of interrelated problems. I believe that we have a means of dealing with them all, but I also appreciate that we really need to move at speed. I'll come back to the House before Easter with an update on the measures that we've taken. I'll work with colleagues across the House in order to ensure that we have the right statutory underpinning. But again, I just want to sort of confirm that we require everything to go right in order to be able to help everyone who's currently facing difficulties. We'll do everything we can, and I hope you'll appreciate that I would not want at this stage to provide an absolute guarantee for people whose specific circumstances I'm not yet familiar with.
Kelly Tolhurst.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I would like to thank my right honourable friend for his statement, which I very much welcome, and I am incredibly grateful to the time that his ministers have spent listening to my concerns and those of the residents at the Wharf in my constituency, who have suffered with a real lack of transparency and clarity around the work that is actually required and if it is needed to be done. But currently they are faced with their management company Y&Y applying to the Tier 1 tribunal for costs as we speak. What assurances could my right honourable friend possibly give my constituents who are very concerned about any outcome that would leave them with bills of between £10,000 to £20,000 payable within the next 6 months?
Absolutely, the intention of today's statement is to try to address the concerns that she's raised so powerfully on behalf of her constituents who face those imminent bills. Can I also say I'm very grateful to her as well for drawing attention to the immensely hard work that's been done by ministers in the department, and the Minister for Housing and Planning, as well as Lord Greenhalgh, and the Minister for Rough Sleeping, the member for Walsall North, have all been working incredibly hard to engage with colleagues across the House and to engage with others in order to try to move this forward. And it's been a collective effort, and I'm very grateful to my colleagues for that.
Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's 4.5 years after Grenfell. The Secretary of State has made clear today the government have failed to solve this problem, but then says his chief action is to write a letter to developers to ask them to come along to a meeting. That's simply not good enough for the thousands of leaseholders affected in Southwark. The biggest threat in this statement is to allow the backdating of action against those who installed unsafe products for 30 years, but it's leaseholders who will be forced to take the legal and other burdens, including the fees involved. So will the Secretary of State not just amend the Building Safety Bill now to finally clarify responsibility and load the burden where it belongs on the developers, builders and manufacturers to properly protect leaseholders, as ministers have promised multiple times but have failed to deliver in this statement today?
Well, the proposals that he enjoins on me are the ones that we're seeking to bring forward. But in fairness to the honourable member, for whom I have a great deal of respect, courageous and doughty campaigner, I can understand a degree of cynicism and or scepticism given some of the missteps that we've had in the past. So I hope that he will, if we do manage to make progress along the lines that he's outlined, I do hope that he'll be in a position then to say that his worst fears were not realised, because I think it's perfectly legitimate for him at this stage to, to want to see the colour of other people's money.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Morello Quarter in my constituency not only has issues with its cladding, but also with other building defects, such as the apparent lack of fire breaks. Can my right honourable friend confirm, will he include these within the scope of these measures, or should I be going back to my residents and telling them to pursue legal action against the developers who don't want to engage with me or with them to try and get resolution for this and certainty?
It is our intention to ensure that those who are ultimately responsible and who are the ultimate owners of the freehold or the ultimate real owners of the building pay in order to ensure that it is made safe. But I will look specifically at the example that my honourable friend raises in order to ensure that we can do everything we can to provide his constituents with the reassurance they deserve.
Stephen Thames.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Will the Minister spell out how the statutory protection he's announced will help leaseholders in developments like Waterside Park, built by Barrett's in my constituency, where there isn't a cladding problem, but the apartments have become valueless because of other serious building defects, missing fire breaks, unsafe installation? How exactly will the statutory protection he's announced help them?
It is intended to ensure that, in this case, and again, I rely on the honourable, right honourable member's description of the particular building. We will talk to Barrett or whoever would be the ultimate owner in order to ensure that they live up to their responsibilities, and there are steps that we can take. And we'll outline what they are when we bring forward appropriate amendments, and we'll make sure that we bring forward those amendments and test them with him and others in order to ensure that they meet the need that he has correctly identified. So our approach is, and there's still a little bit of legal work to be done to ensure that they're as robust as possible.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statement and the work the Minister has done as well. And I hope it's going to bring resolution to people in blocks of flats in Plough Lane and the centre of Wimbledon and Chorus. Can he confirm that he will expect and, if necessary, require lenders to base their lending decisions in future on the new risk mechanism? Because clearly distress has been caused by people being trapped in their houses.
My honourable friend is absolutely spot on, and that is what we will seek to do.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State's been asked from both sides of the House about protecting social landlords and tenants from remediation costs. Will he answer that point, bearing in mind that the biggest social landlords have said that their new housing programmes will cut by 40% over the next 5 years if they have to find fire safety costs themselves? Affordable housing is a particular risk, as yesterday's fire in New York showed. Will he study the lessons of that fire, especially as some of the victims were on the lower floors, which he appears to say are at lower risk, and that lack of compartmentalisation rather than cladding was the cause of most of the deaths?
Well, I know that the honourable gentleman, not least as a former council leader, has considerable experience in this area. He's right that the fire in New York reminds us of the range of risks, and he's also right that we need to take appropriate action in order to ensure that registered social landlords, housing associations and others are not hit adversely. We need to balance different, set of competing goods, but ultimately, as he will appreciate, the most important thing is to make sure that people are in decent, safe homes, and also to ensure that there are more decent, safe homes built where people need them.
Caroline Notes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend spoke earlier about lifting the cloud that's hanging over leaseholders. Can he provide reassurance to residents like those in Banning Street in Romsey, where the building is sub 18 metres, where the freeholder is a housing association and where the defects are not cladding related, that they will be swept up in his reforms? They're looking at costs of £15,000 to £20,000 per leaseholder for new fire escapes, which may well not even be needed. But can he provide the reassurance that they will be helped?
I will absolutely look at that specific case. I don't want to say any more at this point, but she raises a very important point. And again, one of the things with housing associations and other registered social landlords is that we do need to make sure that there is an appropriate balance of responsibility there. But I will look at that specific case.
Emma Harding.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Sadly, cladding is not one of the only risks to building safety, and flooding is another huge risk as well. So while the Secretary of State is open to looking at amendments to building safety in general, will he also look at strengthening the standards for all new public and private builds in terms of flood resilience? And also, while we're on this point, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State did promise me a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss my flooding bill, and I'm sure, as a man of his word, that date will be soon arriving in my email inbox.
The Honourable Lady makes two very important points. We have already changed regulation with regards to flooding, but there is more that could be done, and I will make sure that either I or the relevant minister sees the Honourable Lady before the end of February, if that's okay.
Alan Katz.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome the Secretary of State's statement that will yield significant benefits directly to leaseholders here in England. He has already acknowledged that this is a devolved area of policy, and of course the responsibility falls to the hands of the Welsh Government. But the UK Government, through its initiatives, may well raise significant sums of money that will be for this purpose. What conclusion has my right honourable friend drawn on whether that funding should be ring-fenced to be used for that specific purpose in Wales rather than be diverted for other purposes?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very, very important point, and we of course respect the devolution settlement, but he's absolutely right that money that is generated for building safety should be devoted as far as possible to building safety, and I'll work with him and others in order to ensure the focus is maintained in the way that he outlines.
Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It was a good weekend for Cambridge United, but it wasn't. The misery continues, sadly, for so many people in and around Cambridge who find themselves trapped in buildings which were not built to the expected standards. And as we've heard, it's not just about cladding. It is about fire breaks and so on. And for so many of those people, the lack of an EWS1 form means they're absolutely trapped. They can't move. So what is it in the Secretary of State's statement today that can give them confidence that they're going to be freed from that trap?
Well, can I congratulate the honourable gentleman and all supporters of Cambridge United and extend my sympathies to both Newcastle and Arsenal fans at the unfortunate events of the weekend. Can I also, on a very important point he makes, say that I hope that the withdrawal of the Consolidated Advice Note and its replacement with the BSI-approved PAS 9980 will play a part in helping his constituents and others to be in a position once again to operate fully in the operation of the property market. The lenders to whom I've spoken have given our proposals a fair win so far, but obviously engagement needs to continue.
Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Mr Deputy. In welcoming my right honourable friend's statement today, can I draw his attention to the situation of Nobel House in Redhill, where there are 126 apartments, 86 of which are privately leased. But the ownership, the freehold, has changed twice since the development. The managing agents failed to put in a building safety fund application for the 1.6 billion initial fund. I was told in June there would be a new fund, the 3.5 billion coming forward. That is yet to materialise, and they're now having to pay costs already in for over £2,000 a leaseholder towards the cost of this exercise. Will they get their money back? Can they be fully reassured given the ownership status of the building?
Well, my right honourable friend raises a very important case, and I will look to see what we can do in order to help his constituents. I won't make an absolute promise at the dispatch box at this point, but the situation that he describes is clearly unacceptable.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Shadow Secretary of State said you cannot make a building half safe. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, some residential buildings are possibly even more dangerous than others. In October 2020, over 800 leaseholders and students in the Paragon blocks in Brentford were evicted with 1 week's notice. The buildings were deemed to be so dangerous. They were built by a modular form of building, and the eviction was 2 years after the flammable cladding had already been removed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have reason to believe that the Paragon, and there are other examples around the country, was as a result of both modular forms of construction for which the out-of-date building regulations don't apply, as well as poor, shoddy, badly supervised construction works. So what I want to know is, when will the Secretary of State be bringing up-to-date building regulations through the system? And secondly, when will the Secretary of State address the lamentable culture in the construction industry that the council at the Grenfell inquiry for the Fire Brigade Union said is driven by an agenda of deregulation, privatisation and marketisation? When's he going to do something about that?
Secretary of State.
Bill Brady makes an important point about modular construction, and we do require, through the BOPAS guidance, appropriate adherence to principles with modular construction which should keep buildings safe. She's right that the Grenfell inquiry has also had a number of accounts from a number of witnesses which do raise issues of concern. But while it's important that we continue to take action even before the inquiry concludes, I wouldn't want to preempt the inquiry's conclusion on all of the issues that she mentions.
Damien Green.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend is entirely correct that this is a substantial step forward, and he and the Housing Minister are to be congratulated on it. Can I return to the subject of those developers and companies that have gone broke and have disappeared since they did the things he's rightly castigated them for, some of them not for nefarious reasons. Has he quantified how much money will be absent, how big a hole there is in the money that ought to be available for that compensation from companies like that, and who is going to fill that hole?
Yeah, no, he makes a very good point. I mean, obviously we want those who we can identify as the responsible owner or freeholder of properties to contribute to and indeed to meet the needs of fire safety costs. But it's also the case already that we're looking at the wider development community and indeed at construction products manufacturers in order to help to ensure that we have sufficient resources to provide relief to leaseholders everywhere.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In joining the tributes to Jack Dromey, I think our shock is all the greater because we thought he would always be with us, because the whole of his life was dedicated to being there for others, as a representative of workers and being very proud to serve his constituents. I welcome the statement that the Secretary of State has made today. It represents progress. Loans were never going to work. They were unfair. But my constituents will have listened very carefully to the exchange between him, the chair of the Select Committee, and the honourable member for Harrow West on the question, Harrow East, on the question of liability for non-cladding costs. Because I have many constituents, other members do. The bill is on the mantelpiece. It's staring at them. Given that the Secretary of State has offered statutory protection, what are they meant to do with those bills? Can they confidently say, I don't have to worry about that now because the government is going to sort this out? And when he talks about statutory protection, he mentioned protection against forfeiture and eviction. Can I add a third risk to that list, which is bankruptcy? Yeah. Because that is what many people are facing if they are ever forced to pay these bills they're not responsible for and can't afford.
Secretary of State.
Well, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right. They're not responsible for these problems. They can't afford the bills in many cases. I wouldn't want to precipitately give advice to any individual at the moment about their particular circumstances without knowing every aspect of their particular circumstances. But I do think that it's vital that we move as quickly as possible. And what I will want to test with the right honourable gentleman and others is the efficacy of the legislative solution that we propose to bring forward, because I'm confident that it will help enormously, but I do want to be in a position where he and others have an opportunity to stress test it so that we get the best possible protection.
Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Everybody welcomes the statement of principle that it's immoral that innocent leaseholders should pay for remediation when it wasn't their fault. But if that's immoral for the future, it's also immoral for everybody who has been pursued ever since the disaster at Grenfell Tower. And therefore, can I urge him to revisit the answers that he gave to my right honourable and honourable friends for Hemel Hempstead and Harrow East, because otherwise he's creating a perverse incentive for people to come down on those leaseholders and extract these rip-off fees before any legislation comes into play, if it's only going to be forward-looking.
Secretary of State.
No, I very much take his point, and we will try to make sure that the legislation deals with the potential perverse incentive he alludes to.
On field.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State acknowledged in opening his remarks that the problem isn't simply one of developers' negligence, but is also a failure of regulation for which government is responsible. Leaseholders, I think, will fear that today's announcement will have the effect of kicking a solution further down the road, causing delays for those who have been trapped in an intolerable position for far too long. So wouldn't the Secretary of State accept that the best way of seeking a solution is for the government to fulfil its responsibility by acting to fix the faults without delay, and then using all its powers to recover the money from developers and those responsible?
State.
No, I absolutely take the honourable gentleman's point, but I think that when it comes to some of the regulatory failures to which he alludes, I think that the legislation that we're bringing forward helps to address those. And I also think that it's important that we wait for the conclusions of the Grenfell inquiry before apportioning appropriate weight on the responsibility that rests on central government, the responsibility that rests on local government, and the responsibility that rests on others. But I do believe that the proposals that we put forward today are the best and most expeditious way of ensuring that we can provide support to leaseholders. But of course, we'll keep that under review.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And drawing the House's attention to my register of members' interest as a chartered surveyor, can I warmly welcome this announcement today? And can I ask my right honourable friend about two aspects that he's mentioned in the statement, namely the indemnity given to building assessors and the proper auditing assessment should enable lenders and insurers fairly quickly to offer those products at reasonable rates, and that in turn will get the market moving so that those leaseholders that desperately need to move should soon find that there will be a market for them to do so.
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. That is exactly our intention, and it's the fruit of the work read by my right honourable friend and others.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As I've co-chaired the Leasehold and Commonhold All Party Group, can I just pay tribute to all the campaigners up and down the country who have done a sterling job at keeping this on the political agenda, and they will certainly welcome the principle set out in this statement that innocent leaseholders must not shoulder the burden. I hope that applies equally not just to cladding but also to any other fire safety defects, and also to the cost of interim safety measures that have been necessary. The Secretary of State recognised that in the statement by referring to an extra £27 million for waking watches, but those leaseholders will have already paid out thousands of pounds for waking watches. Will they now expect some reimbursement for those costs?
Secretary of State.
Well, as I've said Firstly, I completely understand and appreciate the concerns expressed by the honourable member. What we're seeking to do is to avert additional costs in the future. It's going to be difficult for us to make good all of the injustices that have been visited on his constituents and others. I don't want to oversell what we're putting forward. I think it's a significant step forward, but it can't resolve every issue from the past. May I also say that I hope he won't take this, but I enjoyed listening to the conversation that he and the Father of the House had on Times Radio at the weekend. And I just wanted to say that the very generous comments that he made about the Father of the House, I echo too.
Claire Katina.
Thank you. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his actions today, particularly scrapping the loan scheme for medium-sized buildings, which will help constituents of mine like Susan Seal and the Russell Square residents in Hawley. I also really welcome the onus that he's putting on developers. Along with the other things he's talked about, would he agree that transparency can be an effective tool in getting people to do the right things? And would he speak to whether naming and shaming can be part of the solution as well?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I think one of the things that we saw just before Christmas with the Kingspan Mercedes deal is the way in which public pressure from the Grenfell community meant that a very big corporate Mercedes did the right thing, and I'm very grateful to Toto Wolff and his team for doing that. So I think we do need to use a variety of tools, and she's absolutely right that transparency is critical.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I convey my party and my own sincere sympathies to the family of Jack Dromey at this time of great grief and sorrow? He made a significant contribution in Westminster Hall last Thursday. He will be missed. I want to put that on record. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and for his clear commitment to finding a solution for everyone in this process? It's clear to me that that's what he intends to do. But can the right honourable gentleman outline what steps he is willing to put in place to ensure that the burden of costs of replacing cladding is not on the tenants alone, because currently too many one-bed apartment tenants are being asked to pay thousands towards this in low wages while developers are sitting pretty? And would the Secretary of State consent to liaising with the Chancellor to see what tax breaks could be utilised for those developers who do the right thing by their tenants?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for the points he makes, and absolutely he's right that there are people who are in small one-bedroom flats who've been faced with huge costs which are totally disproportionate and which we need to relieve them of. And secondly, I think the point he makes about being as supportive as possible of those developers who do the right thing is important, because of course we're in a debate like the one that we're having today, we will concentrate inevitably on those who do need to take additional responsibility, but it's really important to stress that there are many developers, many house builders, many in the property sector who have done the right thing, and we should applaud them for doing so.
Kevin Holmrake.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I draw the House's attention to my registered members' interests? Can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement, which I think ticks all the boxes needed to solve this crisis, not least pointing the finger at construction product manufacturers. There's no doubt they have gamed the system to get some of their products approved inappropriately, but that gaming was facilitated by the Building Research Establishment, which, as he knows, was privatised about 25 years ago. Two things: would he make sure that these manufacturers do contribute towards the cost of remediation, but also would he consider bringing the Building Research Establishment back under public ownership?
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend is incredibly knowledgeable about all matters property and housing. On the first part, absolutely. On the second part, that is a tempting thought, but I'll obviously have to discuss that with the Chancellor.
Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Since last April, I've been seeking answers for a constituent in Cambuslang who's been trying to sell a flat between 11 and 18 metres. It was wrongly assessed to have failed the EWS1 form owing to cladding. The Scottish Government have launched a free-of-charge assessment pilot, but details of full rollout and remediation payments are still pending. What discussions has the Secretary of State had with the devolved administrations about remediating buildings across the UK at greater pace?
Secretary of State.
Well, I wrote to him, was in touch with the Scottish Government, Welsh Government, the Northern Ireland Executive earlier today, and I look forward to working with them. I have to say, as I think the nature of this debate has reinforced, there are people in every party who are interested in practical solutions, and that's incredibly helpful in helping to relieve the problems faced by her constituent and by so many others.
Tom Hunt.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome this statement, particularly with regards to 11 to 18 metres. That does include many of my constituents who will get a great sense of relief from that. There is still concern, which has been mentioned by other colleagues, about non-cladding issues. Restoring proportion section of the speech, very interesting, but ultimately, in 3 or 4 months, I don't want to be in the same position of talking to a leaseholder who cannot sell their property because of non-cladding issues, so a proof will be in the pudding. But an issue that hasn't been raised is when this cladding remediation work is carried out, often the living conditions that those who still live in that building have to live through are completely unacceptable. And I'm absolutely certain that if my right honourable friend visited St Francis Tower in Ipswich, he could not but share my anger at the conditions that my constituents have to live in. So I'd like to invite my right honourable friend to St Francis Tower to see the conditions that they expect to live in.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very, very important point that sometimes work which is absolutely necessary involves a degree of disruption to people's ordinary lives, which is incredibly painful. So whether it's myself or another minister, we'll make sure that someone comes to Ipswich to listen to his constituents. He's an incredibly effective advocate for them, and it's only right that we hear direct from them.
Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Some of the most distressing conversations I've had with my constituents and distressed constituents I've met have been people caught up in this scandal, trapped, unable to move, facing unknown costs, none of which is their fault. So I and they will very warmly welcome the raft of measures that's announced today. But the next question is going to be, well, what next? What's going to happen and how quickly? And can I urge my right honourable friend to clarify the measures that he's put out as soon as possible and drive us forwards to bring them the certainty they desperately need?
Yes, well, my honourable friend and constituency neighbour is right that people will absolutely want greater detail and greater detail soon, and I look forward to working with him and others in order to provide people with the reassurance required. But as I mentioned earlier, while we believe that the measures we put forward today have the potential to resolve so many of the issues that have been faced, I would not want to say that every single individual's problems will be resolved, but we will do everything we can in order to proceed at speed to help.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I refer members to my register of interest. I welcome today's announcements, and I'm sure many of the families of my constituents will welcome it too. But I would like to talk just very briefly with regards to the prevention of fire. We have seen only this weekend the tragedy that has happened in New York, and my thoughts and prayers go out to all affected, as I'm sure I speak for every member in the House too. But this was another electrical fire, and we still have a situation in this country where the question of whether a flat's electrical installation and appliances are tested depends on the tenure of the flat. It's like driving down the road and only rented cars have an MOT. I have raised this before and I will continue to raise this until we can really do something about it. Safe electrics, safe appliances means fewer ignitions, fewer fires, and which means fewer lives lost.
Well, my honourable friend makes an incredibly important point, and of course there are things that we need to do in order to ensure building safety when it comes to construction products and materials and the quality of development and building control. But he's also absolutely right as well that there are fundamental aspects to the wiring and the power supply and the electricity within our homes that do need to be addressed if people to have the safe home to which they're entitled.
David Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Last week I led a debate on the broader issue of developers and house builders making large profits from low-quality homes that cause the owners and the local community problems. Does my right honourable friend agree that the safety issues he seeks to tackle today are on a list of issues people see with these companies, albeit they're the most serious issue, which means that the public will be very unsympathetic if they see further foot-dragging to try and get a satisfactory solution?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and he's tempted me to go into a broader debate, to which I will return. In a nutshell, it is the case that there are many people involved in hazard provision, construction and development who produce safe, beautiful homes with concern for the environment that enhance our communities. And we do need more homes which are safe and decent and sustainable. But it is also the case that there are problems in the system, and behaviour by certain actors that does require to be addressed. Everyone in this House wants to work with the industry because having a home of your own is such an important part of all our aspirations and ambitions. But we do need to recognise that there is more work that needs to be done so that we can be proud of the sector in a way that we'd all want to see, and which I know was very much at the heart of the points that he made in the Westminster Hall debate.
I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for escaping the lift at the BBC this morning in order that he was able to come here today, make a statement and respond to questions for over 90 minutes. So thank you very much. We now come to the business of the day, and we come to the